I spent almost a decade secretly in love with my best friend. Now she's getting married. If you'd asked anyone who knew us growing up, they would have said we were inseparable. We met when we were 13 after I transferred schools halfway through the year. I was the quiet kid who always sat alone during lunch pretending to read a book so nobody would notice I had no friends. She was the complete opposite, loud without being obnoxious, funny without trying too hard, and somehow capable of making everyone around her feel seen. On my second day she sat beside me, stole one of my fries without asking and said, "You look like you need someone to annoy you for the next few years." I laughed harder than I had in months. Looking back now, I think that was the exact moment my life quietly changed. I had no idea that one random conversation would become the center of my world for nearly a decade. As teenagers, we became the kind of friends everyone joked about. Teachers assumed we were dating. Our parents teased us relentlessly. Strangers constantly asked if we were sisters because we always finished each other's sentences and seemed to move through life like we shared one brain. We spent weekends at each other's houses watching terrible horror movies we were both too scared to finish. We'd stay awake until sunrise talking about everything from our dreams to our deepest fears. We promised we'd always be there for each other no matter where life took us. At that age, those promises felt permanent, like nothing in the world could ever come between us. I believed every word. When high school ended, most friendships around us slowly faded. People moved away, got busy, or simply grew apart. Somehow ours survived all of it. Even when we attended different universities, we'd call every single night. Sometimes we had important things to talk about, but most of the time we'd just leave the phone on while studying, comfortable enough to exist in silence together. She was the first person I texted whenever something good happened and the first person I called whenever my world felt like it was falling apart. I knew exactly how she took her coffee, how she scrunched her nose whenever she lied about being okay, and which song she'd play whenever she needed to cry. She knew every broken piece of me too. It never crossed my mind that someone else could know her better than I did. Somewhere during those years, something shifted inside me so gradually I barely noticed it. At first it was just small moments. I'd catch myself staring at her while she laughed and wonder why my chest suddenly felt tight. Whenever she'd hug me goodbye, I'd find excuses to make the moment last just 1 second longer. If she canceled plans because she was busy, I'd tell her it was completely fine while secretly feeling disappointed for days. I convinced myself that was just what deep friendship looked like. I refused to question it because asking myself difficult questions meant risking the one relationship I couldn't imagine living without. Eventually I couldn't ignore it anymore. One evening we were sitting on the roof of her apartment building watching the city lights below us. She rested her head on my shoulder and quietly admitted she hoped we'd still be best friends when we were old enough to complain about our back pain together. I smiled and joked that she'd probably replace me with someone cooler long before then. She looked genuinely offended by the idea and said, "Nobody could ever replace you." Those words should have made me happy. Instead, they broke something inside me because I realized I wanted to be more than irreplaceable. I wanted to be chosen, not as a friend, as the person she couldn't imagine building a life without. That realization terrified me. I never told her. I buried it beneath jokes, late-night conversations, birthdays, road trips, and every shared memory we kept creating together. I convinced myself that if I loved her quietly enough, eventually the feelings would disappear. Instead, they grew stronger with every passing year. I celebrated her achievements while silently wondering if I'd ever be brave enough to tell her the truth. Every time I almost confessed, fear stopped me. What if I lost her? What if she looked at me differently forever? Friendship suddenly felt fragile, like one honest sentence could destroy nearly a decade of memories. Then she met him. I remember the exact day because she called me sounding happier than I'd ever heard her before. She couldn't stop talking about this guy she'd met through work. She laughed at every story she told about him and I forced myself to laugh too, even though every word felt like another crack forming inside my chest. I told myself it was just another boyfriend. She dated before and those relationships had always ended. I convinced myself this would be no different. I smiled through every conversation, asked questions, and pretended to be excited whenever she shared another detail about him. Inside, though, I was beginning to realize something I wasn't ready to admit. For the first time in almost 10 years, I wasn't the most important person in her life anymore. At first, I tried convincing myself I was overreacting. People fall in love, people date, and eventually they build lives together. That's what adults do. I told myself that if I truly cared about her, I should want her to be happy regardless of who made her smile. So every time she called to tell me another story about him, I swallowed the lump in my throat and listened like the supportive best friend I'd always been. I'd laugh when she laughed, tease her when she got flustered talking about him, and even give her advice whenever they had small disagreements. She thanked me for always being there, completely unaware that every conversation was quietly breaking my heart. The hardest part wasn't hearing about him. It was realizing she no longer needed me in the same way she once had. Our routine slowly started changing without either of us saying it out loud. The late-night phone calls that used to last until 2 in the morning became quick 10-minute check-ins. Weekend coffee dates turned into monthly catch-ups because she was always busy making plans with him. Birthdays, holidays, and little traditions we'd created over the years suddenly had someone new included in them. I understood why it was happening, but understanding something doesn't make it hurt any less. I'd find myself staring at old photos of us, remembering the version of our friendship where it felt like the two of us against the world. I hated myself for feeling jealous because he hadn't done anything wrong. He was kind, respectful, and clearly loved her. If anything, he was exactly the kind of person she deserved. That somehow made everything even more painful. The first time I met him in person, I prepared myself like I was walking into an exam I knew I'd fail. She introduced us with the biggest smile on her face, proudly saying, "This is the person I've been telling you so much about." He shook my hand warmly, thanked me for being such an important part of her life, and even joked that he'd heard enough stories about me to feel like we already knew each other. I wanted to dislike him. I wanted to find some reason to convince myself he wasn't good enough for her. Instead, he was thoughtful, funny, and genuinely cared about her happiness. Watching them together was like watching someone else live the future I'd secretly imagined for years. Every shared glance between them reminded me that the life I'd built in my head had never existed outside my imagination. Months passed, and I became an expert at pretending. Whenever people joked that I was practically part of their relationship because I'd known her forever, I'd smile and play along. When she excitedly showed me photos from weekend trips they'd taken together, I'd compliment every picture while fighting the urge to close the conversation as quickly as possible. I learned how to cry in the shower so nobody would hear me. I learned how to answer, "I'm fine," with a convincing smile. Most importantly, I learned that you can love someone deeply while simultaneously knowing they'll never love you the same way. That's a strange kind of grief because there's no breakup, no betrayal, and no dramatic ending. You simply wake up every day carrying feelings you have nowhere to put. One evening she invited me over for dinner, saying she had exciting news. The second I walked through the door, I noticed candles on the table, flowers everywhere, and a bottle of sparkling cider waiting to be opened. Before I could even ask what was going on, she held up her left hand with the biggest grin I'd ever seen. The ring caught the light before my brain fully understood what I was looking at. "He proposed," she whispered, already crying happy tears. For a split second, the entire room felt silent. I hugged her tightly because that's what a best friend is supposed to do. I congratulated her, admired the ring, and listened as she excitedly told me every detail about the proposal. Outwardly, I looked genuinely happy for her. Inside, it felt like someone had quietly closed the final chapter of a story I'd never even had the courage to begin. That night I drove home in complete silence. No music, no podcasts. Just the sound of my own thoughts echoing through the car. When I finally walked into my apartment, I collapsed onto the floor before I even reached the couch. I cried harder than I ever had in my life, not because she'd done anything wrong, but because reality had finally caught up with me. For years I'd convinced myself there was still time, that maybe one day I'd find the courage to tell her how I felt. That tiny sliver of hope had been keeping me going without me even realizing it. Now it was gone. She wasn't just dating someone anymore. She was building a future with him, and I wasn't part of that future in the way I'd secretly wished to be. I barely slept that night. Instead, I found myself scrolling through years of messages we'd exchanged. Thousands of conversations, countless inside jokes, photos from birthdays, road trips, random selfies, voice notes, and memories that stretch back almost a decade. Every message reminded me how much she'd shaped my life. I realized that my biggest mistake wasn't loving her. It was believing that love alone could change reality. Sometimes love simply exists without ever becoming the ending you hoped for. That truth hurt more than I could put into words. A week later, she called me with another request, her voice overflowing with excitement. "I have something really important to ask you." The moment she said those words, my stomach dropped. Somehow I already knew what was coming. "I want you to be in my wedding." For a moment, I genuinely forgot how to respond. My mind knew exactly what she was asking, but my heart hadn't caught up yet. She kept talking, explaining how there wasn't anyone else she'd trust with such an important role, how she'd always imagined me standing beside her on one of the biggest days of her life. She said I'd been there through every chapter: awkward teenage years, college stress, career changes, family problems, and she couldn't imagine getting married without me there. I stared at my phone in complete silence while she waited for an answer. Every instinct in me wanted to say no, to protect myself from the pain I knew was coming. But another part of me, the part that had loved her for almost a decade, could never deny her something that meant so much. So I smiled, even though she couldn't see it, and quietly said, "I'd be honored." The months leading up to the wedding were some of the most emotionally exhausting of my life. I went dress shopping with her, listened to endless conversations about flower arrangements, tasted cake samples, and helped her choose music for the reception. Every decision she made filled her with excitement, and every smile on her face reminded me that she was living the life she'd always dreamed about. I became incredibly good at pretending everything was okay. Friends would tell me how lucky we were to have such a beautiful friendship, and I'd nod in agreement while carrying a secret that felt heavier every single day. There were moments I'd excuse myself to the bathroom during wedding planning meetings just so I could take a few deep breaths and compose myself before walking back out with another smile. A week before the wedding, she asked if we could have dinner together, just the two of us. We ended up at the same little diner we'd been visiting since high school, sitting in the exact booth where we'd once spent hours talking about our futures. The familiarity of the place made everything feel surreal. Halfway through the meal, she looked at me with an expression I'd seen countless times before, the one that meant she was about to ask something serious. She gently reached across the table, squeezed my hand and said, "Can I ask you something honestly?" I nodded. She hesitated before quietly saying, "You've seemed different these past few months. You're here but it feels like part of you is somewhere else. Did I do something wrong?" That question broke every wall I'd spent years building. I looked down at our hands and realized I couldn't keep carrying the weight of my silence forever. Taking a shaky breath, I admitted something I'd rehearsed in my head 1,000 times but never believed I'd actually say out loud. I told her that I'd fallen in love with her years ago, that I never expected anything from her, that I never blamed her, that I'd kept it hidden because I couldn't bear the thought of losing our friendship. I apologized for not being honest sooner and assured her I wasn't trying to change her mind or interfere with her wedding. I simply didn't want the most important person in my life to spend forever wondering why I seemed so distant. She didn't interrupt me once. She just listened, her eyes slowly filling with tears. When I finally finished, the silence between us felt endless. Then she stood up, walked around the table and hugged me tighter than she ever had before. Through tears, she whispered that she was so sorry I had carried that pain alone for so many years. She admitted she'd never realized how deeply I felt because she'd always believed our friendship was exactly that, a friendship. She told me I deserved someone who loved me with the same certainty that I loved them. It wasn't the ending my heart had secretly imagined, but it was something just as important. It was honesty. For the first time in years, neither of us was pretending. On the morning of the wedding, I almost didn't go. I stood outside the venue for nearly 20 minutes, wondering if leaving quietly would be easier than watching the person I loved marry someone else. But then I remembered something she'd once told me when we were teenagers. Real love isn't measured by who stays when it's easy, it's measured by who shows up when it matters. Those words pushed me through the doors. I watched her walk down the aisle looking happier than I'd ever seen her. As painful as it was, I also realized something unexpected. My love for her had never been about possession. It had always been about wanting her to find happiness, even if that happiness didn't include me in the way I'd once hoped. After the ceremony, she found me during the reception and hugged me again before thanking me for keeping my promise to stand beside her. She introduced me to relatives as the best friend who's been with me through almost everything. I smiled because despite everything it was true. Later that evening, her husband pulled me aside and thanked me for always looking out for her. He said he'd heard countless stories about our friendship and hoped we'd continue being part of each other's lives. I looked at him and realized there was no bitterness left. He hadn't stolen anything from me. She had simply followed her own heart just as everyone deserves to. The weeks after the wedding were difficult, but they were also strangely peaceful. I started therapy, something I'd avoided for years because I believed I could handle everything alone. I slowly began rebuilding a life that wasn't centered around waiting for feelings that would never be returned. I traveled more, reconnected with old friends, picked up hobbies I'd neglected, and eventually learned that healing isn't about forgetting someone. It's about accepting that some people shape your life forever, even if they aren't meant to walk beside you forever. Loving someone isn't a failure simply because they don't love you back. Sometimes love teaches you resilience, compassion, and the courage to let go. It's been over a year since the wedding now. We're still friends, although our relationship naturally looks different than it once did. There are healthier boundaries, more balance, and far fewer unspoken emotions weighing everything down. Every now and then, I catch myself thinking about the life I once imagined, but it no longer leaves me devastated. Instead, it reminds me how much I've grown. For years, I believed closure was something another person could give me. I was wrong. Closure came the moment I stopped wishing reality had been different and finally accepted it for what it was. If there's one thing I've learned from all of this, it's that loving someone silently for years doesn't make you weak, and being honest doesn't always guarantee the ending you hope for. But carrying the truth forever can become a heavier burden than facing rejection. Some stories aren't meant to end with romance. Some end with gratitude, growth, and the quiet realization that loving someone can still change you for the better, even if they're never yours. Don't forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment for more crazy confessions I get from people.